Okay, thank you to everybody for joining. Tonight, we are going to give a shiur, slightly unusual from our regular schedule. We just started the tremendous topic of Shemona Esrei, and we gave a historical background to the scholarship and the study of the history of Shemona Esrei. And soon we're going to go into the sections of Shemona Esrei one by one to dissect how each section of Shemona Esrei developed and how each beracha became the way we have it today. However, I was asked last week if we were going to do anything about Pesach, so I made the personal mistake of exploring the idea of doing Nishmat, and I got a little bit too caught up. So we're doing Nishmat. Let's put it very simply. I wanted to study Nishmat Kol Chai because I know that every year that I study the Haggadah Shel Pesach, with the vast amount of data and material there is to study on Haggadah Shel Pesach, you can only learn so much every year. So I figured this year I'll study the history of Nishmat Kol Chai, which is one of the parts of the end of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Now, the beautiful part, I'm sorry, let me share a different screen because that's the wrong screen to share. The beautiful part about Nishmat Kol Chai is not just in its language and its content, but it's known to all Jews who pray as one of the most personal, beautiful prayers in Lashon HaKodesh that exist in the Jewish liturgy. It is said commonly after Pesukei de Zimra on Shabbat, right? So the morning, Shabbos morning, we say Nishmat Kol Chai, the breath of all life, Tevarech et Shimcha, shall bless your name. It's a beautiful, beautiful tefillah. And somehow it ends up in the end of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. But if you pay attention, if you are unlucky enough to have two or more versions of the Haggadah at your Seder table, you're going to notice that there's going to be some confusion at the end of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Luckily, most people are too drunk and too tired to really understand at the end of the Pesach Seder why in the world all the Haggadot are different. But in some of the Haggadot, you'll find that it ends the regular Hallel, right? The Hallel HaMitzri, we call it, the regular Hallel, and it says Yehalalucha, and then it'll go to Hodu Lashem Kitov, which is called Hallel Hagadol, and then it'll end with Yishtabach. While the Sephardi ones predominantly will skip Yehalalucha altogether, go straight to Hodu Lashem Kitov Kilom Chasto, which is the Hallel Hagadol, and then finally end with Yishtabach and Yehalalucha. It doesn't conclude Yishtabach. It doesn't say the bracha. It says Yehalalucha and says the bracha of Yehalalucha, and that's how it ends. So it's confusing. And if you actually have a facsimile, if you're one of those fancy rich people who bought either a real or a facsimile edition of the medieval Haggadot, if you buy one of the medieval Haggadot, you're going to see that they do it even differently. In the medieval Haggadot, they have in the medieval Haggadot, they have a bracha by both. They have a bracha by Halalucha and a bracha by Yishtabach. So how in the world did any of this happen? What is Nishmat? Who wrote it? How did it get into the Haggadah? We're going to discuss all of that tonight. So let's begin with the first time we hear any mention about Nishmat. The first time we hear any mention about Nishmat is Gemara and Pesachim. The Mishnah says that by the fourth cup of wine, after the fourth cup, we say Hallel, and then we say Birkat Shir. My Birkat Shir, says the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Rabbi Yehuda says Yehalalucha Hashem Elokeinu, the bracha which begins with the words Yehalalucha Hashem Elokeinu. This is the bracha that we're all familiar with that comes at the end of Hallel, right? Every time we say Hallel, not every time, okay, but every time we say Hallel Gamor, every time we say the complete Hallel, we end with the Yehalalucha. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan, it says Nishmat Kol Chai. This is the bracha that starts with the words Nishmat Kol Chai. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages have taught, Revi'i gomer alav Hallel ve'omer Hallel Hagadol divrei Rabbi Tarfon. So it brings a different opinion. Brings the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon that instead of saying the regular Hallel that we say Hallel Hagadol instead. That's the Gemara that we're gonna have to talk about soon. This Gemara is the first source. This is Rabbi Yochanan, who lived in the 3rd century, so that means in the 200s. The first source for something called Nishmat Kol Chai. Now, Rabbi Yochanan just calls it by its name. So if you just call it by its name, Nishmat Kol Chai, that means everyone's familiar with what you're talking about. So that means that at the very latest, by the 2nd century, but by the 100s, early 200s, Nishmat Kol Chai was already a known beracha. Now, as we discussed when we learned Yishtabach, there were different types of brachot that were invented in the time of the Tanaim and Amoraim in order to conclude a Hallel. The Pesukei de Zimra was called Hallel. The Hallel HaMitzri that we say every day is also called the Hallel. The Hallel HaGadol is called a Hallel. So there were different brachot that were designed to end the Hallel. One of them was Yishtabach, that was created in Bavel. One of them was Yehalalucha, which was used more in Eretz Yisrael. And finally, here we have another one called Nishmat Kol Chai. We don't know anything about this bracha in the time of Rabbi Yochanan besides these three words. And interesting, we have Rabbi Yochanan again in another Gemara, Brachot Daf Nun Tet Amud Bet. The Gemara over there is talking about the bracha that you make after a community receives rain after praying for it. What do they say? Amar Bihuda Modim Anachnu Lacha Kol Tipa V'Tipa Shorat Talanu. Right, so that's the quote unquote praise or blessing that people say after Hashem gives rain after a fast or after a prayer for rain. Rabbi Yochanan, same person, Misayim Bahachi, he would finish the prayer as follows: Ilu Finu Malei Shira Kayam. Right, this is also from Nishmat as we know it. Right, until the words V'chol Koma Levcha Tishtachaveh. Baruch Hu Hashem Rov HaHodaot. Blessed are you, Hashem, who is abundant to whom abundant thanksgivings are offered. This is Rov HaHodaot, is the ancient way of ending Yishtabach. As far as we know, there was Kol HaTishbachot, Melech Gadol Mehula B'Tishbachot, but the most ancient way, as far as we know, is Rov HaTishbachot or Rov HaHodaot. Okay. Now, with Nishmat, one of the best eyes that have ever looked at Nishmat have been the eyes of philology. Philologists are people who study ancient texts that are made up of languages that we don't really, people don't really speak anymore, like Latin texts, Greek texts. So some of the great Jewish Talmidei Chachamim and the great Jewish scholars were trained philologists, such as Rabbi Daniel Goldschmidt. Rabbi Daniel Goldschmidt was probably one of the two greatest Jewish philologists of the 20th century. And he has a Haggadah Shel Pesach, which is published by Mossad Bialik. It's essentially a Hebrew version of his original German version that he wrote in Berlin. Now, he was mechavein, right? He had the same bright idea when he looked at Nishmat and he was studying it philologically as the Ravid, the Baal HaEshkol, one of the Rishonim. You see, the eyes of a philologist are going to unpack layers to a text. They're going to see different parts of it, who wrote what, when, where it seems to divide, which authors wrote which part, what era in history is responsible for each section, etc. That's really the eyes and the training of a philologist. So what he saw was that Nishmat appeared to him to be three blessings. Number one was the part beginning with Nishmat Kol Chai until Ulecha Levadecha Anachnu Modim. Number two is the part beginning with V'ilu Pinu Malei Shira Kayam. And number three is the poetic additions after B'chol Koma Lefanecha Tishtachaveh. As far as I remember, the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, we have a slightly different end. If you ever open an Ashkenaz Sidur, they have Shechenad, Moraim, V'kadai, Shemai, right? They have a slightly different end to Nishmat Kol Chai. So he saw in that there were three different sections, potentially written at three different times. And in his opinion, it's really the Paitanic expressions, the additions of the Paitanim, which changed the ending of Pesukei de Zimra on Shabbat to the Pesukei de Zimra of Shabbat that we know today. Essentially, let's put it like this. Let's say there were multiple brachot that would end the Hallel, right? With Nishmat, Yehalalucha, Yishtabach, and others, right? So how would Nishmat itself look? According to Daniel Goldschmidt, if you look at the text, right, this is probably what it was. Nishmat Kol Chai Dvarech Hashem Chal Elokeinu Baruch Habasar Tefaret Tomein V'Zechecha Malkeinu Tamid Ki Me'olam V'Ad Olam Atakel Baruch Ata Hashem Melech Mehula B'Tishbachot, right? Because it ends Umei Olam V'Ad Olam Atakel, right? That's the third line of Nishmat. So to his eyes and to the eyes of other scholars, this seems to be the original Nishmat. The original bracha of Nishmat probably was just Nishmat Kol Chai, and it ended with Baruch Ata Hashem Melech Mehula B'Tishbachot, just like a short blessing of Yishtabach, just like a short blessing of Yehalalucha. However, because it was such a beautiful first three lines, it was expanded upon and expanded upon. Now, the scholars who studied the tefillah in Eretz Yisrael, such as Ezra Fleischer, noted that in Eretz Yisrael they had a very different system. In Eretz Yisrael, we know that today we say Psuke de Zimra, right? That's our oeuvre, our collection of Tehillim that we say every day. However, in Eretz Yisrael, they didn't have the Psuke de Zimra that we say, right? We say the Halalukas and the Ashreis. In Eretz Yisrael, up until like the 11th century, when that Nusach still existed and they followed Talmud Yerushalmi, they had something called Tefilat Hashir. Their version of Psuke de Zimra was much more a different set of the psalms than ours. And I believe it's from the 15 Shir Amalot, and they say one or two more. Now, the end of Tefilat Hashir has a ritual called Birkat Hashir. Now, Birkat Hashir is essentially a bracha to end Psuke de Zimra, just like Rabbi Yochanan said, right? The Gemara says, "My Birkat Hashir." What's Birkat Hashir? Meaning, which bracha of Birkat Hashir do you mean? In Eretz Yisrael, the minhag was to say to finish Yehalulucha Hashem Elokeinu, right? That was they would finish Psuke de Zimra not with Yishtabach like us, but they would end it with Yehalulucha just like a regular halal, because Psuke de Zimra is also a halal. But in Eretz Yisrael, they also ended the Psuke de Zimra of Chol with Ilu Filu Malei Shira Kayam. So Ilu Finu Malei Shira Kayam was the ending of Birkat Hashir for them. So their Birkat Hashir, they had Tfilat Hashir, and then Paitanic expansion, Ilu Finu Malei Shira Kayam, and then finally they would end with Yehalalucha. There was a certain era where a lot of these poetic embellishments and elaborations began to get combined. And that's why we find that the Bavli bracha of Yishtabach gets combined with Nishmat, it gets combined with Ilufinu, it gets combined with the Shochin Ad Marom and the other poetic things at the end, finally culminating in the ending of Yishtabach. Now, some people will notice that the Sephardi Sidurim will have an acrostic of Yitzchak and an acrostic of Rivka, right? So some people have suggested, well, maybe that last part was written by a poet who, maybe him and his wife, maybe he wrote it for his children. So there's been all sorts of speculation as to exactly who wrote that final section. Now, that's so much for the official history of who wrote Nishmat. Now, we're going to see a little bit more in a second, but that's for the official history. Now, the unofficial history of Nishmas is a lot more sensationalistic. If you look at the Siddur of Hasidei Ashkenaz and the sources they bring there, they have this claim that Nishmat Kol Chai was written by Saint Peter. No, yes, that's St. Peter. So in case you're not Christian and you're not very familiar with any of this, Peter is one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. The man had 12 apostles, of which Peter is supposed to be supposedly in some faiths the preeminent one. And Peter has a whole special history to him. And Peter is, let me show you this Rembrandt of Peter is always depicted holding keys, because Jesus told him he was going to have the keys to heaven. Like, he's going to be one of the most important saints of Christianity. So how in the world how and why would the Hasidei Ashkenaz make a claim that somebody like Saint Peter would have written Nishmas Kol Chai? So let's back up. In medieval times, there was a series, a collection of texts that were circulating among the Jews. It began in the Dark Ages, right, before the year 1000, and it continued into the Middle Ages. This era had texts that would go around among the Jews that were so-called folk tales, and these folk tales were alternative readings or other histories of what actually happened with Yeshu, what actually happened with Jesus. Many of these had different names, but one of the most famous ones is called Toldot Yeshu. Toldot Yeshu is a book which gives a completely alternative history to what happened with Yeshu. And of course, it's completely profane. And of course, it's completely sacrilegious for Christians. It's essentially says that, Jesus was born out of wedlock and that he was a sorcerer and that he was a bad person and that he hated the rabbis. It has all sorts of agendas in it. If you're interested in reading it yourself, the Otzer HaMidrashim by Rabbi Yehuda David Eisenstein collects a couple of these midrashim. One of them is called what's it called? One of them is called Haggadah Shel Pesach, which we're going to discuss in a second. And many of these stories circulated. Now, let me just admit somebody, 1 second. So many of these stories circulated in medieval times. And the idea of these was really to counter, on the one hand, it was to counter Christianity. On the other hand, it was to give a new sense of faith to helpless Jews. So I was listening to a shiur by Rabbi Daniel, I think his name's Korubkin from Toronto. He's one of the rabbis in Toronto, and he has a shiur on the Pope who wrote Nishmas, right? The idea of Saint Peter writing Nishmas. And he makes the mistake of, it's a great shiur. I recommend you listen to it. It's online. And he makes the mistake of taking these midrashim seriously, as if they're Tanaitic, like real from midrashim from the time of the Tanaim. These are not real midrashim. These are folk tales which got passed along and got regurgitated and rebranded over and over. They got so bad that even Martin Luther himself writes a polemic against these Toldot Yeshu, against these histories, these alternative histories of what happened with Jesus. But I'll just give you this is the opinion of some dude on the internet, and I just love it so much because he's a funny guy, this person. He was contributing the text of Toldos Yeshu, and he contributed it with an English translation. So he puts it like this. His name's Isaac Mayer, a very interesting guy. It says, one of many variants of this notorious work he presents the Sefer Toldot Yeshu is perhaps an irreverent retelling, a bitter deconstruction, a mocking parody of the Christian narrative of the birth, life, and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Taking its general structure from the Gospels, it co-opts and alters it to make the main character look like a petty, vindictive sorcerer, his disciples into either sectarian liars or loyal rabbinic plants, and his followers into easily duped fools. Toldot Yeshu was a very popular work in medieval times, and you can tell this sort of text was certainly written by someone whose primary relationship with Christians was fear. What he's saying is that the Jews who wrote this clearly were living under the fear of Christian governments and goyim who were going to oppress them and try to convert them and try to change their minds about Christianity, usually with baptism and force and a lot of very unpleasant government actions. It's the bitter invective. I'll just continue. It's the bitter invective of an oppressed people without power for themselves, the dirty laundry that 2,000 years of murder leaves behind. It's also just like unspeakably, hilariously crude. I'm no expert in the Gospels, but I'm pretty sure that at no point in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or even John, does Judas Iscariot defeat Jesus in an aerial wizard battle through the streets of Jerusalem by, I'll say the nice word, urinating on him, thus removing his power of flight. It's insanely funny. A lot of the story here is just bizarre, and so much of it is crude and insane and a mockery of Christianity, and a lot of it gives alternative histories. Now, one of the most important alternative histories that it gives is the Haggadah of Shimon Kefa. Now, as we all know, Peter and Paul were two of the main founders of Christianity, and the alternative history is as follows. It says that, you see, Peter was just a fisherman in the Christian lore, but he was ascended to royalty, so to speak, and the papacy by Jesus himself. And the name of Peter was originally Shimon, right? Shimon Kefa, and Kefa in Aramaic means rock. And I think the Greek word is Petros, so therefore it became Petros. Shimon Petros became Shimon Peter. Now, the alternative history is not that Yeshu chose him to be the rock of Rome, right? He makes a pun on his name that I'm going to give you the keys of heaven and I'm going to make you the rock, the kefa of Rome. Because yeah, it's again, I'm sorry that if we have any Christian watchers on YouTube, I have a Jewish perspective on this, so some of this looks a little bit. I mean, some of the Christian Bible to us looks a little bit outlandish, but essentially, he asks his followers, "Does anybody know who I am?" And they all give their different answers. And then Peter says, "I heard that you're the Son of God, and that you're the Messiah." And he says, "Oh, who told you that? It must have been that you had Ruach HaKodesh, and someone must have told you that. Therefore, you must be." I'm going to establish my kingdom of heaven through you. That's what it says there. The Jewish retelling is completely different. There's two stories. One story is that Shimon Kefa was really a Tana. He was really a holy sage, and he was forced by violence to come to the Christian side. But he was very secretly, he was still observant to Judaism, but he made it his mission to protect the Jewish people at all costs. And he educated the Christians that they were not to forcibly baptize Jews, that they weren't to harm Jews, that they were to leave them alone, like all the things that you would expect somebody writing an alternative history and he wanted the Christians to leave the Jews alone would say. Like all of those things are right in there. Another version of it is that he was a mole. The rabbis got together and they said one of us has to go in and they have to make Christianity a different religion than Judaism. Judaism is too similar to Christianity. Everyone's going to get confused. You got to be a mole. You got to go in and change the religion. And so Peter went in. Shimon, this Tana Shimon went in. He accepted. He made everybody else accept the sins for him, and he pretended to be Christian. And essentially, at the end of his life, he asked them to make him a tower of rock, right? To make him a kefa, right? They called him Shimon of the rock, right? Shimon kefa. He said, build me a tower. This tower of Agios Petros is just the Tower of St. Peter in Greece. It has nothing to do with the story, but the story is that he was the Pope who ruled from the tower. And he said that I'm going to stay here. I'm going to do my thing. And I'm going to come out once in a big blue moon to go give you instruction and to preach to you the word of God. But in the Jewish version, well, he was just trying to keep Judaism in secret. So he asked them to leave him alone and he was going to stay inside the tower and do his business. Now, in this what's it called? Legend. It says that while he was in the tower, he spent his time by writing piyutim, by writing poetry, and he sent all the poetry far and wide to all the rabbis, and he got it approved for inclusion in the liturgy. The most famous of those two would be Ahavat Olam, right? The bracha you say before Kriya Shema, and secondly, Nishmat Kol Chai. These are the two claims that this folktale makes. Now, some people have said that, like Larry Hoffman, for example, he believes that the whole reason the folktale harps on Nishmas, why does it choose Nishmas? Why would you say Peter wrote Nishmas of all the prayers? Is because Shochen Ad Marom Shin Ayin Mem, when there's a nun in there too. So many people saw in that an acrostic of Shimon, even though it's a backward acrostic. So many people saw that as an acrostic for Shimon. They figured someone named Shimon must have written it. And if you look in the Siddur of Hertz and the Siddur Kol Chai, they both say, "Oh, Shimon ben Shetach," like one of the earliest Tanoim from the 1st century. Really? I mean, it's a very, very shaky grounds to say that somebody like that wrote it. But the folk tales of Toldat Yeshu don't necessarily tell us so much about history, right? Very often myths and folk tales don't tell you much about the true history of what actually happened. Rather, myths and folktales tell you more about the people telling the story. What does it tell us about the people in the Dark Ages who were telling the story, or the people who perhaps edited it in medieval times who were telling the story? It tells us that they believed that Nishmat Kol Chai was A, extremely beautiful, B, very venerated, C, very early, and D, written by a singular institution and approved by a singular institution. There was a single body, whether it was one person or one assembly that got together and wrote it. Most of the scholars of the Middle Ages did not see Nishmas as 3 different tefillos. They didn't look at it philologically. It was only the Ravid who saw it and said, no, wait a second, this is 3 parts. Most of the scholars looked at it and saw it as one piece. And if you look in the Rokach and other Rishonim, they attribute it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, because they too saw it as a very early prayer, very beautiful prayer, very canonical prayer. Therefore, they just say, oh, when the Anshe Knesset Hagdola instituted Nishmas Kol Chai, that's their opinion. The Ravid holds it's 3 different parts, created in 3 different times, and that's Rabbi Daniel Goldschmidt also believes. And then you have the other claims of Shimon Bachetach, et cetera, et cetera. So many other claims that are, not historical. The bottom line is we cannot know who wrote Nishmas. You will find the claim that it was Shimon Kefa or St. Peter who wrote Nishmat Kol Chai. However, it has no historical basis for it. It first appears in the early medieval times. Some Rishonim might have believed it, but like Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yaakov, but many rejected it. In Rashi's school, there was a person named Simcha from Vitré who wrote a machzor called Machzor Vitré. Vitré is a place in France, and he says that whoever says such a thing when the Beis Hamikdash, he says ta'ut shel duma, which I think comes from the French. He says it's a grave error, right? Like duma, like it's a pasuk in Tehillim, right? Sheol, I forgot the pasuk. Keduma nafshi, but essentially this is a grave error, and whoever says such a thing that Saint Peter wrote Nishmat, when the Beis Hamikdash is built, he's going to have to bring a chatat. He's going to have to bring a sacrifice to atone for his sin that he dared say that Saint Peter wrote. Nishmat Kol Chai. Okay, so that's what we know. We know that Nishmat is definitely from earlier than the 3rd century. We know that it's most likely the product of 3 different prayers that were glued together at the end of the 1st millennium. The rest of the history is just tells us more about the people who say it than about the truth of the history itself. Now, how did it end up at the end of the Haggadah? We should get to that, but let me bring you one more thing before I do that, because I forgot to include this in. There's one of the Chasidei Ashkenaz. His name was Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, right? He's one of the great scholars of Germany. The Germans believed in this fable of Nishmas being written by Shimon Kefa, but he has a kina, right, a lamentation for his wife, and he basically speaks about his wife was murdered by 2 Christian thugs. His wife, his 2 daughters, and some of his friends were just murdered one night in a horrific tragedy. And it's terrible to read, and it's such a tragedy. It's incredible that he picked himself up and he continued to, and he became one of the leaders of the Jewish generation after such a personal tragedy like this. The thugs were caught and killed, just if you want a silver lining. But in his lamentation for his wife, one of the things he says about her is, Mishoreret zimirot utfilah umedaberet tachanunim. She would sing the zmirot and prayers, and she would always speak the supplications. And her hands, and every day she would seek out to prayer. This is a poem to the Nishmat Kol Chai, to the breath of all life, and she would also say the poem of Kol Maminim. He's basically saying that his wife would say every day Nishmat Pituma Ketoret and Kol Maminim, as if you look through the poem. So this shows you that this was considered such a dear prayer that people would say it every single day, as like after the prayers, they would say Nishmat. It's a beautiful thing. It was like one of their mamadot. After tefillah, they would say Nishmat Kol Chai. Today, you'll find them in Hag that people will make a minyan to put Nishmat Kol Chai at the kaisel. Some rabbis were for it, some rabbis were against it. Just some people have the minyan that if they have the minhag, the custom that if they are in a place of danger, if there's an earthquake, they say a promise that if I'm saved from this danger, I'm gonna go say nishmas at an Aron Kodesh, or I'll go say nishmas with a minyan. It's like a segula for being saved. People believe in the power and the magic of Nishmas Kol Chai, and it only speaks to its veneration, to how the Jews venerated Nishmas in its beauty, its simplicity, its poetic form. It's just remained one of the core, most beautiful tefillot that we have. Okay, so now let's understand how it got into the Haggadah. Let's look once more at this Braita. We saw that the Gemara brings in Pesachim, the Kufiyut Chet Amud Aleph, this Braita, Tanu Rabbanan, Revi'i Gomer Alavat Halel, Ve'omar Halel Hagadol, Divrei Bitarfon. There's an essential problem with this Braita, and that is that the Vilna Shas is wrong. The Vilna Shas says Revi'i, the 4th person, is he's Gomer the Halel, and he says Halel Hagadol. The real text of this was Chamishi, Gomer Alavat Halel, and then he says Ve'omar Halel Hagadol Divrei Bitarfon. Essentially, what that means is Rabbi Tarfon holds that there is 5 cups, not 4 cups, but 5 cups. Rabbi Tarfon is one of the Tanaim who holds that there are 5 cups to the Pesach Seder, not 4. Rashi, however, and many of the scholars of France and Germany did not believe that was possible. It wasn't possible that such a shita, that such an opinion existed. Why not? Because they had another Gemara, which they thought meant that you're not allowed to drink or eat anything after the Afikomen. So if you can't eat or drink anything after the Afikomen, how in the world can we have a 5th cup? Therefore, Rashi and the other Rishonim didn't believe this could be the Gersa, and therefore they said that this is Revi, Gomer Alavat Halal, and Rabbi Tarfon is just adding that you say Halal Hagadol. In this view, that Tarfon's adding Halal Hagadol, you have the following problem. If you have, you know what? Let me first tell you how the Gaonim do it. The Gaonim say, to put it more simply, the Gaonim held that there was a shita that you need to have 5 cups. Therefore, if there is a shita that you have to have 5 cups, that 5th cup, according to the Gemara as it comes out, is a reshut. It's optional. So if you don't say the 5th cup, right? If you don't want to drink a 5th cup because you're not in the mood of more wine, according to the Gaonim, you don't say Halal Hagadol. Halal Hagadol is contingent on saying, Halal Hagadol is contingent on having a 5th cup. So the Gaonim themselves, who don't hold like Rashi and they hold like the normal reading of the Brisa, they say, okay, there's a 5th cup. If you want, it's a reshus. You could have the 5th cup, but if you do it, then you have to say Halal Hagadol. Now came a problem. How about all those people who are saying the Halal Hagadol? All those people who are saying it, do they end it with nothing? So there's 2 solutions in the Gaonim. One solution of Amram Gaon solution is to say Yahalalucha twice. They'll say the Berachas Ashir 2 times. One after regular Halal in the 4th cup, one after the 5th cup and Halal HaMitzri in the 4th cup, and one after Halal Hagadol in the 5th cup. Rav Sadia Gaon says, no, just say Halalucha all the way at the end and finish both of them with the Halalucha Hashem Elokeinu. That was what they did in the Gaonim. Nobody said Nishmat Kol Chai. In the time of the Gaonim, no one said Nishmat Kol Chai was not a part of the Haggadah at all. When Rashi and the Chassid and the Rishonim in Ashkenaz decided there was no such thing as a 5th cup and that you can't have a 5th cup, that's when the minhag became to add Nishmat, because they needed a Birkat Ashir. What are you going to end Halal Haggadah with? What are you going to end Halal Haggadah with? We need a Birkat Hashir, and because nobody ever says Yishtabach should be the end of it, they assume that when Rabbi Yochanan says Nishmat Kol Chai, he means the Nishmat Kol Chai that we know that has Yishtabach at the end, which is a very retrojecting idea. But they essentially understood that you would say Halal Hagadol, say Nishmat the way we do it in Pesukei Zimra, and end it with Yishtabach and a bracha. That was the way Rashi and the Rishonim from Ashkenaz understood it. So think about that again. One solution is, according to the Gaonim, don't say Nishmas at all. And just say Halalucha once or twice. The next solution, according to Rashi, is that, give me a second, to say both, which is you put Nishmat after the concluding bracha, as the concluding bracha of Halal Gadol, but Halalucha is the concluding bracha of Halal Mitzvah. But the Greek Jews did something different. They would put Nishmas after Yehalalucha, and then they would say Halal Hagadol. Very strange. They do Yehalalucha, Nishmas, Yishtabach, and then Halal Hagadol at the end. Because according to the way Yosef Tabori sees this, Yosef Tabori understands that essentially Rashi's cup, the 5th cup got deleted, but the Halal Hagadol remained. So Rashi managed to delete the 5th cup, but for some reason Halal Hagadol remained. Now, Rabbeinu Chaim, one of the Balei HaTosfos, who's a Talmud Muvak of Rabbeinu Tam, he objects to having 2 identical brachas one after the other. So he took a different approach. He said, let's do Yehalalucha after Halal HaMitzri. Just don't add the Chasima. Don't add Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Mula B'Tishbachos. Then say Halal Hagadol. Then say Nishmas Yishtabach and say the full Chasima. That was his opinion. But nobody did it. It wasn't until the Torah recommended it that in the 15th century, the Machzorim started changing it. Okay. I'm doing all this for coverage. I know it's a little confusing, but I want to cover as I wrote in the title, the confusing history of the end of the Haggadah. I'm sorry if the end of it is confusing. The Sfaradim follow the Beit Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch, where he says, I don't really like that for halachic reasons. I would say that instead we should say all of them, say Halal HaMitzri, say Nishmat Kol, say Halal Hagadol, then say Nishmat Kol Chai, then say Yishtabach, don't end it, and then say Halalucha and say the bracha. No 2 Haggadahs agreed on this. Unfortunately, here's, for example, the Darmstadt Haggadah. This is a Haggadah from the 1430s in Germany. Beautiful Haggadah. Over here, you'll see Halalucha Hashem ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Mula B'Tishbachot, and then it begins the Hodul Hashem Ki Tov in the entire section. I just skipped out a few pages. Then it does Nishmat, and then it doesn't end with Yishtabach at all. It's a very confusing thing. Many different Haggadot will have a different ending to the Seder. Hopefully this year, you'll be too tired, too drunk to even notice. But at the end of the day, this is the complex history of it. Now, I just wanted to cover one more thing. If anybody is familiar with the scholarship of the Haggadah, the latest and greatest sefer on the Haggadah is from Reb David Henschke from Bar Ilan. He wrote a sefer called Manishtana. It's available on Magnus Press for like $28 US. Manishtana is a titanic work of scholarship, and he's an incredible Talmid Chacham. And he essentially dissects the Seder of Pesach and how the Tanoim perform the Seder of Pesach. One chiddush that he said, which I thought was very beautiful, is that he has a pshat in how and why Reb Tarfon holds you need a Kais Chamishi, and why that Kais Chamishi has to be accompanied by Hallel Hagadol. He brings a proof from earlier where Reb Tarfon has a dispute on the Berchas HaGeula, and he says that Reb Tarfon had a lot of deep personal he had a personal problem, a personal emotional struggle with having the Seder of Pesach and the Hallel HaMitzri, the praise of God, this be said at a Seder after the Churban. After the Churban Abayis, when there was no more Korban Pesach, there was no more Halela Paka Igra, right? The Hallel that would break the roofs, the excitement of singing Hallel on the rooftops of Yerushalayim. When all of that excitement of Hallel was destroyed and the Korban Pesach was destroyed along with the Beit HaMikdash, he felt like it was impossible to just have a Seder of Pesach that included only our celebration of a previous redemption. That didn't make any sense to him. How could we sing and thank Hashem for a previous redemption when we're sitting here in Galut? It doesn't make any sense. Reb Tarfon held that we had to put an emphasis on the Geula today, and the Geula of today and in the Geula of the future, which is why he holds of the fifth Kais, which represents the last V'hitzesi V'havesi, right? That I brought you to the new land. And in the view of Reb Tarfon, you have to say a Hallel that doesn't just speak of the miracles that Hashem did for us in the time of Pesach. It has to be a Hallel that also speaks about the miracles Hashem does for us throughout history, in our generation, and the parnasa that he gives to us every day, and that miracle, which ends because this Hallel Hagadol is representative of not just the Nisim Hashem did to us in the past, it's rather representative of the Nisim Hashem do for us in the present and in the future. Reb Tarfon held that this is the correct Hallel to say on the night of the Seder. Ever since the Churban, that was his personal emotional take on how we had to celebrate the Leil HaSeder. With that, we will end our study of Nishmat. Bezrat Hashem, next week, we're going to all be very busy preparing for Pesach, so I'm going to recycle a shiur that I gave last year on the history of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. I will do my review and research for the shiur. We're going to review the history of the book, the Haggadah Shel Pesach, how that book came to be, and Bezrat Hashem, we will all continue on Shmon Esrei after Pesach. So thank you everyone for your time and attention, and we will continue next week. Okay.
Thank you, Moshe.